plenty of ideas that have triggered off thoughts here. I think, firstly, though, I'd just like to say that Roberto makes a very valid comment in the comments there about the fact that we too often waste peacetime where we ought to spend a bit more. We ought to make greater effort on development and testing. I think that's an important one just to flag there. I think my sort of next, I got a few little points picked up on the conversation, but my next one is really a reflection that we've really been talking about, principles and perhaps critical questions that city authorities or governments should be asking themselves. But clearly, one size doesn't fit all in terms of the arrangements and the ability to be able to manage crises. And we do need to, or rather everyone needs to respect what constraints they're working under, what crises they may be facing, and indeed working within local cultural arrangements in order to work out what works best. A couple of things that we haven't really sort of touched on here, but I think Sherrod began to raise there, is about that sort of moving beyond the engagement across government with foreign government with the private sector into that whole sense of community and voluntary sort of volunteer enablement on this. Yeah, I think what there was a time, 10, 12, years ago during the time of Superstorm Sandy and the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, where everyone was at the volunteers, they saved the day on that hugely valuable resource when actually some of the governmental arrangements, didn't work quite so well. There seems to be more of a debate in some countries, at the moment as to, well, really, volunteers need to be deployed within a clear framework, because then sometimes they can create more problems than they're actually resolving there. And I think, David, you sort of mentioned perhaps a sort of, heading off to Ukraine without a clear sense as to what people are going to do there, and actually perhaps, being slightly problematic. So I think there is a whole set of questions about volunteer mobilization here, which I think is and the right conditions for doing that, which I think is very important. And again, they're going to come back to local circumstances and local capabilities on that as well. And I think the final sort of point from me here is around that broader, and again, Sherrod touched on this, about a broader community preparedness overall. I mean, yes, certain places are totally geared up towards certain crises. David, you referred to Japan and kindergarten and preparation for tsunamis and earthquakes, and everyone has alerts. I was in Mexico City yesterday, and the alert went off there for a seismic alert. Actually, it was a very relatively small earthquake in Acapulco, but still the alarm went off in Mexico City, and everyone knew what to do. But I think there is that broader sense of preparedness, and I think some of the Baltic countries or Scandinavian countries are very, very strong on this in terms of their civil defence arrangements, which are raising preparedness for a whole variety of crises on this. So everyone actually has a sense of purpose, has a sense of their own preparedness for these issues as well. So I think that sense of it's not just the capabilities that are provided by the sort of preparedness arrangements within a city, but it's also how a community understands what it might be facing and its own responsibility for its own preparedness around that, and how, as we saw during the pandemic, actually communities and sub-communities did down to street level did mobilize very effectively to look after vulnerable citizens and friends and family and etc. as part of that too.
Great stuff. Douglas?
There were a number of leagues there to pick up on in what you were saying, Richard, and I'm conscious I'll pick up on one of those, and it's building on what Sherrod said before. But to me, it's a really, really critical point here is around that communication point within an organisation and then across, and how essential that is for that resilience conversation at a local community and at a city level. The more often than not, risk management and this concept that we're talking to as a broader framework piece around crisis management and preparedness and response, which is an entire area of expertise in its own right. And I know we'll have a number of emergency response practitioners and managers on the call today, and very much deeply relevant in terms of the training that's in place around those kind of programs. But when we're talking to that local community level, can often be overcomplicated in terms of the frameworks and the actual reality of what that is on the ground, and what principles need to be put in place, and become very overwhelming, especially for smaller organisations with less funding, that are hugely critical for that overall resilience at a city level, or at a regional level in particular, in different countries. But as a basic principle, what we're speaking to here is highly effective communication, and how you enable that in a time of a crisis, so people can make the right decisions and be enabled to do what they need to be able to be doing best. And it's often that communication channel that breaks down in the first instance and drives to other problems, and then leads to a more of a complex or less resilient outcome at the end of the day. So to me, at that point, and Sherrod, you made it really, really fantastically before, so I don't want to echo it too much, but that point around communication is absolutely fundamental there. And as you were saying just before, Richard, as much of that can be done in terms of establishing that and helping people understand what they need to be doing, but also who they need to be communicating with, or who they need to be receiving messages from in that time of crisis. As much of that can be done ahead of an actual crisis event is your absolutely critical planning pillar. In any country, as you were talking to, like in Mexico City, in any country where earthquakes are common, small children will learn at a very young age exactly what you do in that kind of situation. Similar in tsunami alerts for any coastal country or island country as well. And the principles that come with those get embedded really, really quickly around what you do in an emergency scenario. Drop, cover, hold, for example, as is drilled into school children in New Zealand. It becomes really, really critical. But at the end of the day, what that is a communication piece, whether or not it is ahead of time or helping people understand who they need to be communicating with or from. And it's often overlooked, or really, as a basic principle, overcomplicated, and becomes something that is seen as something really, really onerous, rather than the basic principle of really what that is for a city level. So, yeah.